Wage slavery has been the most pervasive working condition since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in all modern states, whether they call themselves democratic, capitalist, communist, or whatever. In order to legitimize wage slavery, educational institutions, especially in our state capitalist culture, have sought to emphasize only the worst features of chattel slavery, while doing the opposite with wage slavery, whose existence is in fact rarely even acknowledged. For example, our typical image of a wage slave is a smiling employee in a corporate ad, while the typical images of chattel slaves involve chains, whippings, etc. This is because a balanced look at both, examining the similarities between owning and renting a person, reveals facts that are incompatible with our self-image of freedom. As you've heard many times in my videos, wage slavery denotes a coerced set of choices. That is, a person must sell his or her labor power, submitting to the authority of an employer in order to prosper or merely to subsist. Now, it's true that unlike a chattel slave, a wage slave can sometimes choose his boss. But a boss is a boss is a boss. And the authoritarian relationship and coerced set of choices that I mentioned remain the same, even if you could choose between a million bosses. First of all, let's look at a few facts. The chattel slave's property, that is capital. As such, the chattel slave's value to an economically rational owner is in some ways higher than that of a wage slave who can be fired, replaced, or harmed at no or less cost, since the chattel slave's owner has made a greater investment in terms of the money he paid for the slave. For this reason, in times of recession, chattel slaves could not be fired like wage laborers. In fact, American chattel slaves in the 19th century had improved their standard of living from the 18th century. Their height had been increasing, and as historians Fogel and Engermans reported, slaves' material conditions in the 19th century were better than what was typically available to urban wage laborers at the time. This was partially due to slave psychological strategies under an economic system different from wage slavery, a system in which chattel slaves were able to exploit paternalism. For example, in the American South, slaves partially retained an African, essentially pre-industrial work ethic, which stressed hard work, but within a cultural framework which avoided freneticism, time discipline, materialism, and acquisitive individualism. This was because most southern plantations were run by essentially pre-capitalist masters, which enabled slaves to create autonomous spheres like personal relationships, familial bonds, and a distinctive slave religion. In fact, slaves developed a variety of subtle techniques such as feigning illness, sabotage, and deliberate go-slows in order to protect themselves and their culture. Slave women, by using contraceptives, engaging in sexual abstinence, and occasionally practicing infanticide, not only limited their own exploitation, but circumscribed their planters' profits. Similarly, wage slaves' standard of living has improved since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and various strategies and struggles adopted by wage slaves, including a very bloody labor history, are deemed to have created structures like unions, welfare institutions, etc., that can constrain the destructive mechanisms of wage slavery. But it is not unreasonable to speculate that if chattel slavery had continued, the chattel slaves' material conditions would have kept improving as they had been, and would still in many places be better than that of wage slaves. Now, a wage slave's starkest choice is work for a boss or face poverty and starvation. Indirectly, prison, beatings, insults, and other punishments, including death, lay in store for many of those who try to survive without working for a boss. For example, workers trying to democratically run a capitalist factory, live freely in buildings, or grow and collect food, medicine, and other goods freely from land and factories capitalists own, and so on. Now, It's true that if a chattel slave refuses to work, a number of punishments are also available, from beatings to food deprivation. But economically rational slave owners actually practiced positive reinforcement to achieve best results, and before losing their investment or even friendship by killing an expensive slave. And of course, the cases of work-related deaths and diseases have increased enormously with wage slavery. I mean, on top of the exploitation and misery around the world, every year millions of wage slaves die of work-related injury and illness. Even in a rich country like the United States, over 50,000 wage slaves die every year from work-related injury and illness. That's quite apart from the hundreds of millions who have died from the more indirect consequences of systems based on wage slavery, like famines, wars, etc. In fact, environmental degradation and the handling of nuclear weapons by people following orders for wages hint at the mass suicidal tendencies of hierarchical systems such as wage slavery. The chattel slave is sold once and for all. The wage slave must sell himself daily and hourly. The chattel slave, property of one master, is assured an existence, however miserable it may be, because of the master's interest. The wage slave, property as it were of the entire owning class, which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, has no secure existence. The chattel slave is an outside competition. The wage slave is in it and experiences all of its consequences, including insecurity, mental illness, lack of solidarity, and of course unemployment, which the owning class requires in order to discipline wage slaves. Bosses in both wage and chattel slavery argued that their system created a lot of wealth and prosperity. Both did, in some sense, create jobs, and their investment entailed risk. For example, slave owners might have risked losing money by buying expensive slaves who later became ill or died, or might have used those slaves to make products that did not sell well on the market. Marginally, both chattel and wage slaves may become bosses, sometimes by working hard. It may be the rags to riches story which occasionally occurs in capitalism, or the slave to master story that occurred in places like colonial Brazil, where slaves could buy their own freedom and become slave owners themselves. Social mobility, or the hard work and risk that it may entail, are thus not considered to be a redeeming factor by critics of wage slavery. The methods of control in wage systems differ substantially from those in chattel systems. For example, in his book Disciplined Minds, American physicist and writer Jeff Schmidt points out that professionals are trusted to run organizations in the interest of their employers. The key word is trust. Due to the fact that employers cannot be on hand to manage every decision, professionals are trained to ensure that each and every detail of their work favors their right interests or skewers the disfavored ones in the absence of overt control. In other words, the resulting professional is an obedient thinker, an intellectual property whom employers can trust to experiment, to theorize, innovate, and create safely within the confines of an assigned ideology. In fact, statistical evidence shows that subordination to elite ideology, including aggression, is greater among those with more schooling, a conclusion corroborated in other studies as well. In the book Propaganda, the father of public relations Edward Bernays argued that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. He said that those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Similarly, Walter Lippmann argued that the manufacture of consent amounted to a revolution in the practice of democracy and allowed the bewildered herd to be controlled by their betters. Some supporters of chattel slavery claimed that those who had not studied in depth the economic and social aspects of slavery could not form a recent opinion on the matter. Similarly, some modern economists believe that the uneducated are not in a position to reject economic systems involving wage slavery. For example, Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Samuelson asked how can anyone without the disciplined study of economic science form a recent opinion about the merits or lack of merits in the classical traditional economics.